I can also see you on the sidebar.
Mhm.
By the way, I hope you have the skill. You know, if you use two screens, Zoom allows you to put the people in one
Yes,
screen and the material in the other screen, which
exactly. So now I have,
wonderful.
oh, okay. So I have you on the other screen, but I'm um, reading off this primary screen. So I would look like I'm looking at you. Okay, whereas I don't. Okay, so here is the thing. I gave it a main title, and the reason I hope will be obvious pretty soon. So it's called Intellectus Quaerens Fidem, Revelation and Reason. And the main title of this talk is the obvious inverse of the famous Anselmian formula, Fides Quaerens Intellectum, most aptly summarizing the scholastic program of rational theology, highlighting the idea that the careful use of principles of reason can lead us to an ever deeper understanding even of the most mind-boggling doctrines of religious faith. But then, the inverse of the Anselmian formula should point to the idea that religious faith with proper understanding can be a profound source of illumination of our otherwise rather pedestrian understanding of principles of reason. Indeed, viewed from this perspective, one may argue that religious faith has a certain liberating effect on the human mind, leading it to insights concerning its own principles, which otherwise, relying on its own resources alone, it would not reach. At any rate, this is the point that I wish to argue for here, based on a careful analysis of the methodological conflict between the purely rationalistic philosophical methodology of medieval Latin Avarists and the faith-inspired rational theological methodology of Thomas Aquinas. For influenced by post-Enlightenment mentality, one may easily fall prey to the following, as I shall argue, deceptive piece of reasoning. Any methodological doctrine that imposes theological dogma upon philosophical inquiry delimits the autonomy of philosophical inquiry. Therefore, ex opposito, any methodological doctrine that separates theological dogma from philosophical inquiry increases the autonomy of philosophical inquiry. But the Latin Averroist methodological doctrine of veritas duplex, rather improperly but not entirely unreasonably called so, separated theological dogma from philosophical inquiry. Therefore, the Latin Averroist methodological doctrine of veritas duplex increased the autonomy of philosophical inquiry. Well, Jeremy just arrived. So it seems. A little note popped up on my screen. Okay,
Yes.
hopefully it will show up.
Hello,
Okay,
hello, hello.
now, so after this little deceptive piece of reasoning inspired by post-enlightenment mentality, I will argue against it. In what follows, I shall argue that despite possible appearances to the contrary, in its proper theoretical and historical context, the Latin Averroist methodological doctrine, in fact, delimited the autonomy of philosophical inquiry, while in the same context, Aquinas' methodological conception of philosophy as the handmaiden of theology was not only much more beneficial for the autonomy of philosophical inquiry, but it was even suitable to prompt such genuine philosophical advances that the Averroistic conception would not have prompted at all. So here is the illuminating effect of religious thought or faith. So let's see first the Averroistic conception about this autonomy of philosophy. When the autonomy of philosophy is considered in a medieval context, one thing should be clear at the outset. The autonomy of philosophy in that context could in no way mean the absolute independence of the results of philosophical inquiry from theological considerations. Accordingly, any medieval philosopher had to react somehow whenever a perceived conflict between theology and philosophy emerged. Another methodological axiom of the period is that when, on account of such a conflict, one of two incompatible propositions has to be denied, one of them being a theological and the other being a philosophical proposition, it is never the theological proposition that is to be denied, provided that it is an unambiguous expression of some revealed truth or of some evident consequence thereof. Or more briefly, revealed truth coming directly from the first truth, veritas prima, has absolute epistemic priority. Accordingly, whenever perceived conflict between faith and reason emerges, in keeping with these universally accepted general methodological principles, the conflicts cannot simply be ignored and cannot be resolved by the denial of some revealed truth. But then it seems that there is really little room left for a genuine resolution. For if the conflict is genuine, that is to say, if we find that a revealed truth or a conclusion thereof and a philosophical conclusion are such that the affirmation of the one, along with unquestionably true premises, validly entails the denial of the other, that the only move allowed by the above described methodological principles is the denial of the philosophical conclusion. But then, if the philosophical conclusion is in fact a valid consequence of first philosophical principles, then this move at once entails the denial of at least one of those principles. However, how could this be allowed by a philosopher whose first principles are self-evident truths, the denial of which directly runs counter to the very nature of human reason? What I call for the purposes of this paper, the Everistic conception, intends to resolve this further conflict by means of postulating a certain relative autonomy for human reason in a manner analogous to the relative autonomy of natural agents. In keeping with this analogy, just as a natural agent has its proper operation determined by its own natural principles, so too reason has its proper operation guided by its own appropriate principles, namely the first principles of philosophy. Furthermore, just as the proper operation of the natural agent regularly produces its appropriate effects, assuming the common course of nature, while this operation can always be overruled by the operation of a superior agent, so too the proper operation of reason regularly produces its own appropriate effects, namely the conclusions derived from its own rational principles. Still, this operation can also be overruled by the principles belonging to a superior intellect, namely the articles of faith revealed to us by the grace of the divine intellect.
Judah, may I ask you a question just to understand the term that you are
Yes.
using? When you speak about reason,
Yes.
you are talking about some
Yes.
structure that is outside of the person, or reason as a human faculty that includes the way
reason as a human reason. I'm talking about reason as a human faculty, which, given its nature, has its built-in rational principles
to a
that
limit.
determine so for instance, no properly functioning human reason can deny the first principle, the principle of self-contradiction.
Okay.
That would be
because
Aristotelian stance.
This
Yes.
kind of reason is usually today, nowadays, psychiatrists check it to see, if you have problems in your reasoning, it means you need some medicine, it will correct it. It's something which is,
yes.
It is something with that has to do with what happens in your soul alone, in your brain, in your thinking process alone. That's what you're talking about. It's totally intimate.
This is not necessary. This is, even if it is individual and as such personal, as long as it is working according to the healthy functioning of the nature of this faculty, it is common to us all, specifically because our individual human reasons work as human reasons, all right? As, which is common to us all, and in that sense, this is objective, so it's not intimate and personal, and my mind is working one way, and your mind is working another way with regard to these first principles of reason. Because, of course, I can think privately something that you wouldn't ever think of, etc. But that is not the issue here. The issue here is how a human reason as such, whether it is your human reason or mine, is supposed to be working.
Okay, sure.
Right?
Now I see what you're talking about. Okay. So it's not a logical construct, but it's something common to all human beings.
Exactly. It is. Just as we have the naturally functioning biological organs, lungs, heart, etc., etc., which, as long as they are functioning properly in accordance to the dictates of our nature, they are these individual organs work according to and in accordance with the same physical principles. Right?
Okay.
So the blood is pumping the heart. The heart is pumping the blood, etc. Even if there may be individual variations, but as far as it is a human heart, it has the function of pumping the blood in a human body to maintain circulation. Right?
I see.
Okay. So in that sense, it is objective and naturally determined for us all. So it is, in that sense, it is not idiosyncratic in any way, even if it is realized in individuals. Just like human nature is realized in individuals. Individually, differently, with different modifications, but insofar as we are all humans, it is the same common nature. Right?
Okay.
So the same goes for reason as the natural faculty of the human mind. Okay?
Sure.
All right. So, I just started out with this analogy set up by the Latin avarists concerning natural agents with regard to the causal principles and rational agents with regard to the principles of reason. Now, the analogy might be tempting, and it seems to suggest a genuine alternative for the autonomy of philosophy, however relative this autonomy might be, while at the same time preserving the due superiority of the articles of faith. For according to this conception, what a philosopher, while philosopher, has to do is simply rely exclusively on the natural principles and operations of human reason, normally completely unaffected by any theological considerations. But when he perceives a conflict between some of the products of this operation, that is some philosophical conclusion, and some article of faith, he simply needs to acknowledge the invalidity of this conclusion on account of the superiority of the article of faith, much in the way, sorry, oh, I'm getting these notifications. Sorry. So, but when he perceives a conflict between some of the products of this operation, that is some philosophical conclusions and some article of faith, he simply needs to acknowledge the invalidity of this conclusion on account of the superiority of the article of faith, much in the way he would acknowledge a miracle that happens contrary to the ordinary workings of nature on account of the superiority of the supernatural agent that produced the miracle. To be sure, since the philosophical conclusion thus discarded was a consequence of self-evident principles of reason. Its falsity should also falsify some of these principles, much in the way the operation of the superior agent would invalidate the natural principles of operation of the natural agent. But this falsification need not result in our discarding any of these principles. Indeed, not any more than the occurrence of a miracle would eliminate the normal workings of natural agents under normal circumstances. On the contrary, the conflict can serve only as a reminder that these principles, however self-evident they are to us, can have only a restricted relative validity, which can always be overruled by some higher principles. But as long as their validity is not subjected to such superior constraints, they do work well in producing their own consequences in exactly the same way as the principles of natural agents produce their own effects in accordance with their nature. Indeed, just as they would always and necessarily produce their natural effects, were it not for the occasional miraculous intervention of the superior agent. As a matter of fact, in the framework of the Aristotelian theory of demonstration, these methodological considerations are not based on a mere analogy between the operating principles of natural causes and the rational principles of natural reason, but rather on a strict correspondence between the two kinds of principles, given that the demonstrations of natural reason proceed precisely from rational principles which refer to the operating principles of natural causes. Accordingly, when philosophical conclusions are based on such principles, the occasional conflict with faith can easily be resolved precisely with reference to the fact that the operations of natural causes can be miraculously overruled by a superior cause. So it is not just a mere analogy, but a strict correspondence. Thus, in a commentary on physics, probably written by Zischer of Brabant, we can read the following. The philosopher, when he concludes that something is necessary or impossible on the basis of inferior causes that can be investigated by reason, does not contradict faith, which asserts that those can be otherwise because of a supreme cause whose power on causality cannot be comprehended by some creature. Or, as Boethius Dacus, another famous Latin averroist, even more clearly states the same point. In this way, the Christian states something true when he says that the world and the primary motion had a beginning, and that there was a first man, and that numerically the same man will be resurrected, and that a generable thing can come to be without generation. But this is conceded to be possible only for a superior cause, the power of which is greater than the power of a natural cause. However, the natural scientist will also state something true when he asserts that this is not possible by natural causes. For the natural scientist denies or concedes nothing except on the basis of natural causes, just as a grammarian, as such, denies or concedes something only on the basis of grammatical principles and causes. Therefore, according to this conception, it might even seem to be a simple mistake to be suspicious of philosophical conclusory to faith, for we should all know and presuppose that the demonstrations of these philosophical conclusions have only a relative and limited validity, but not absolute validity, for they proceed only with the assumption of the undisturbed operation of natural causes. As Boethius Dacus wrote, and this is the source of the error of many people who think that physicists would want to demonstrate some conclusions absolutely, for they demonstrate them only in respect of certain conditions or with the supposition of certain assumptions, on the basis of which it is impossible for those conclusions to be otherwise. Now, however tempting this solution might appear, and however naturally it seems to provide room for the relative autonomy of philosophy, St. Thomas had good reasons to object to the methodology involved in it, not so much in the interest of faith against philosophy, but rather in the interest of philosophical inquiry itself. So here is St. Thomas's alternative. the freedom of the handmaiden. As is well known, St. Thomas had a very simple basis for asserting his position concerning the necessary accordance between faith and reason. As he most succinctly stated in the Summa Contra Gentiles, although the above described truth of the Christian faith exceeds the capacity of human reason, nevertheless, those principles with which reason is naturally endowed cannot be contrary to this truth. For it is obvious that the principles which are naturally placed in reason are maximally true, so much so that it's not even possible to think that they are false, because they are the natural working principles for all humans, right? So it is not even possible to think that they are false. But neither is it viable to believe that which is held by faith to be false, given that it was so evidently confirmed by divine revelation. Since, therefore, only falsehood can be contrary to truth, as is manifestly clear from the considerations of their definitions, it is impossible that the principles naturally recognized by reason should be contrary to the above-mentioned truths of faith. It's beautiful. That is to say, since both the principles of reason and the articles of faith are necessarily true, while truths can imply only truths, and no truths are contrary to any truths, there cannot be a conflict between faith and reason in the sense that either a truth of reason or a truth of faith could ever entail the denial of the other. But then, how can it happen that philosophers apparently draw many conclusions from truths of reason, which are clearly contrary to some articles of faith? St. Thomas's answer is quite simple again. When philosophers appear to conclude to claims contrary to the truths of faith, they are simply mistaken. And from this, it is evidently concluded that any arguments propounded against the teachings of faith do not correctly proceed from the first self-evident principles inscribed in our nature. Therefore, they do not have the efficacy of demonstrations, but they are either probable or sophistic arguments. Hence, room is left for their refutation. Indeed, if there is a genuine conflict between conclusions derived from faith and the principles of philosophy, the source of the conflict is not to be sought in the genuine principles of philosophy, but rather in the defective use of the principles of philosophy. As he says, but if one finds among the claims of the philosophers something that is contrary to faith, that is not philosophy. But if one finds among the claims of the philosophers something that is contrary to faith, that is not philosophy, but rather the abuse of philosophy stemming from the defectiveness of reason. And so it is possible to refute such an error, either by showing that it is entirely impossible, or by showing that it is not necessary. But what is most important from our point of view here is St. Thomas's insistence that whenever a perceived conflict emerges, since what caused the conflict was a mistake in the use of philosophical principles in the first place, the resolution of the conflict is but a further philosophical task. But we have every reason to be confident that this philosophical task can be carried out, for we know that the truths of faith never invalidate any genuine true philosophical principle. As he says, the gifts of grace are added to nature in such a fashion that they do not eliminate it, but rather perfect it. This is the famous formula. Gratia non destruit natura perfectit. Hence, the light of faith, which is infused into us by grace, does not destroy the light of reason divinely bestowed on us. And even though the natural light of the human mind is insufficient for the manifestation of those truths that are manifested by faith, it is nevertheless impossible that those truths that are divinely taught to us by faith should be contrary to those that are given to us by nature. For then one of these would have to be false. And since we have both from God, God would be the teacher of some falsehood to us. And this is impossible. That is to say,
So, Julia, just
yes,
to, I'm sorry I interrupt, just to understand.
well,
So actually what he says is that faith claims that there is no contradiction between faith and philosophy because it all starts from God, and this is a claim of faith. So actually the basis is faith.
And vice versa, because at least the faith in the preambula fidei, that is on the fact that there is a God and that God is the first truth, so being the creator of everything. And so all truth derives from God. We have a reasonable philosophical ground for
Yes,
these
but yes,
preambula fidei. And then once we have that philosophical ground for claiming that there's a God who is the first truth, who is the source of all truths, we can say that, yes, we have a good philosophical grounds also for claiming that faith cannot contradict reason, and vice versa. So it is not in and of itself just a pious religious idea, as far as Aquinas is concerned, and as far as I'm concerned also. It is a perfectly reasonable, rational ground for not even faith, this confidence in the truthfulness of revelation and the truthfulness of what is achievable by the correct use of natural reason.
that is, if you see natural reason as a gift of God.
Yes.
And so this, and you say this is by itself is not a pure point of faith.
That's right, because that is it is a philosophical conclusion that there's a first cause of everything, the creator of everything,
Yes.
and therefore us being creatures of this creator of everything, including our nature and all our natural faculties, of course, our reason and its rational principles are also coming from the source of all truths and all being. These are you don't have to, let me just put it this way, you don't have to go to church to figure this out. Which is not to say that you don't have to go to church, but absolutely speaking.
No, but I have to go to church. I have to go to the church
or the synagogue,
or
yes.
the synagogue, whatever. No,
Yes.
I'm saying
Yeah.
I have to go there in order to assume that maybe there is another attitude that is not covered by logic, and the principles of logic are very limited, and they represent only a certain aspect of the existence around us. For example, our logic can cover things that are, as you say, big things, and not quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics seems to contradict logic. Because, so I can say, okay, there is a contradiction between logic and faith, philosophy and faith, because our logic is not complete. But that's, Thomas Aquinas says, it's not true, because our logic, we went to the synagogue or to church, and we were granted our logic by God, so our logic should be as complete as need be.
Yes, and who says quantum mechanics?
Quantum mechanics, that things, the simple thing of logic that something is either one thing or the other at the same time, or the two things cannot be in the same place at the same time. So
these are not really logical principles. These are
No?
no, these are physical principles. The um, impossibility of co-location of two bodies. Well, it is for two entities. It is it is probably true of solid bodies that they
But
cannot.
not of particles, right?
Yeah.
So,
So it is not. It is not a formal truth of logic. It is not one of the pure principles of reason. It is a physical principle with certain um, limited validity, namely concerning only solid bodies, the way they occupy place. Because, of course, places can be occupied by different types of entities in their different ways. Say, radio waves and, and magnetic fields can overlap without further ado, and gravitational
but in
fields.
any case,
Yeah.
the claim is that our logic is perfect because it was granted by grace of God.
It is, well, it's not to say that our logic is perfect, because obviously it has its limitations. But as long as we are using it correctly, using the principles of natural reason correctly, we are not going to arrive at falsehoods from self-evident truths. And self-evident truths will have to be regarded as self-evident because they are the very principles of operation of our reason.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Got it, yes.
All right. So, so just to summarize, that is to say, since we know that both the natural principles of reason and the supernatural principles of revelation, both coming from the first truth, have to be true, we should also know that it is impossible for a genuine conflict to emerge between the two. Therefore, whenever an apparent conflict emerges, we have the genuinely philosophical task of detecting the fallacy that accounts for the illusion. But since in this process, no genuine philosophical principle is ever invalidated, we know that all we have to deal with is the correction of ordinary human error, which we know can safely be carried out by applying the ordinary self-correcting mechanisms of natural reason, namely philosophical analysis and philosophical disputations. That is why that was the medium of this self-correcting operations of reason, the scholastic disputations. That is exactly what they were invented for. Okay, now perhaps on the basis of this brief side-by-side presentation of the two methodological conceptions, it is already clear what we should and what we should not regard as the fundamental difference between the two, and why I can claim on this basis that in the given historical and theoretical context, Aquinas' conception provided greater room for philosophical inquiry than the Everistic conception did. For the difference is obviously not that while the Everistic conception would assert the validity of philosophical conclusions despite their conflict with faith, Aquinas' conception would impose theological dogma on philosophical inquiry by denying the validity of philosophical conclusions and hence the principles from which they follow because of their conflict with faith. To be sure, at one place, Boethius' Docus appears to suggest that a philosopher should maintain his position even despite its conflict with faith, when he says, but he has to deny that truth which he can neither cause nor know on the basis of his principles. and which is contrary to his principles and destroys his science, namely the philosopher. For just as one has to concede that which follows from one's principles, so also one has to deny that which is incompatible with these principles. But then he immediately goes on to qualify what he just said. The natural scientist has to deny these claims, for the natural scientist concedes nothing except that which he sees to be possible by natural causes. And afterwards, in reply to the question whether in this case the natural scientist would assert something false, he says, for anything denied or conceded by a natural scientist, insofar as he is a natural scientist, is denied or conceded by him on the basis of natural causes. Hence, the conclusion by means of which natural scientist states that the world and the primary motion did not have a beginning, taken absolutely, is false. But if it is referred to the arguments and principles from which he concluded to, it does follow from them. That is to say, the natural philosopher's denial of an article of faith, or equivalently, his assertion of the contrary conclusion, according to this conception, amounts to nothing more than the assertion that the proposition contrary to faith follows from his principles. But as far as the truth or falsity of this conclusion is concerned, absolutely speaking, regardless of what it followed from, Boethius declares that the conclusion has to be claimed to be false precisely and exclusively because it is contrary to faith. But then the inevitable consequence of this position is that if this conclusion is indeed a valid consequence of philosophical principles, then at least one of these principles will also have to be asserted to be absolutely false. And so the further inevitable conclusion is that in view of the truths of faith, philosophy must be radically flawed, involving some absolute falsity among its genuine first principles. However, this is precisely the point on which Aquinas would disagree. For as we could see, according to his position, concerning the philosophical principles, no genuine philosophical principle can ever turn out to be false. Therefore, on this basis, we can state that the fundamental difference between Aquinas's and the Everistic conception is that while the Everistic conception maintains only a rather shaky and precarious autonomy of philosophy, allowing that even its genuine principles can always be overruled by the authority of theological truth, Aquinas' position allows for the much safer autonomy of philosophy by proclaiming the absolute validity of its genuine principles and by relegating the apparent conflicts between faith and reason to the sphere of simple human error, detectable precisely by means of these principles. So, in fact, it is rather the Everistic conception that imposes dogma upon philosophical inquiry. Indeed, so much so that it even allows the falsification of its genuine first principles precisely and exclusively on account of their conflict with faith. By contrast, Aquinas' conception never allows the position that genuine philosophical principles could ever be falsified on the basis of their conflict with faith, because according to his position, there can never be such genuine conflict in the first place. But if an apparent conflict emerges, then this is only a new challenge for the philosopher as such, to check the validity of his argument and of his premises. For even if he finds that the conclusion validly follows from the actual premises, he may well find that what he took to be self-evident philosophical principles figuring as the premises of his arguments were in fact only some false propositions that he mistook for self-evident principles. In this way, the philosophical re-examination of his arguments and his premises is even likely to produce such philosophical results which would simply be ignored on the basis of the Everistic methodology. In fact, this is precisely what we can detect in Aquinas' handling of a number of issues in which there appears to be a conflict between philosophical principles and articles of faith. Perhaps this is the clearest in the case of the apparent conflict between the theological doctrine of the Holy Eucharist, according to which the accidents of wine and bread should exist there miraculously without a subject, and the Aristotelian definition of accident, according to which an accident by definition is something that exists in a subject. For given this definition, the claim that an accident is not in a subject would entail the contradiction that the same thing is both an accident and not an accident, whereas the contradiction cannot be made true even by divine omnipotence. The way in which Aquinas resolves this apparent conflict is perhaps one of the best illustrations of his general methodology. Rather than simply claiming that in this case omnipotence overrules ordinary principles of reason, well, indeed, this would be a tough call where the first principle, the principle of non-contradiction, is concerned. He provides Avicenna's philosophical analysis of whether the notion of being can figure in a definition as a reason for re-examining the definition of accident as it is usually quoted. As a result of this re-examination, he ends up with a refined, philosophically clarified definition, which not only provides us with a solution by showing that the positing of accidents without a subject miraculously sustained by divine power is not self-contradictory, but also with a general insight into how the quantities of various sorts of entities signified by their essential definitions are related to their modes of being, which then also influences the treatment of a number of other purely philosophical questions, such as the question of nature and mode of being of the human soul. By contrast, in discussing the question whether an accident would in this way be separable, Seizure simply states that given the definition of accident, this is impossible, while at the same time he acknowledges that it is miraculously possible, leaving the emerging philosophical conflict, namely his claims conflict with the principle of non-contradiction, simply unresolved. But in accordance with the common philosophical slogan based on Aristotle's remarks at the beginning of Book 3 of the Metaphysics, the resolution of doubts is the manifestation of truth, and so the unresolved doubts prevent the manifestation of truth. I'm afraid something is missing from this sentence. In any case, indeed, in any case. So the point is clear that given this quote from the Metaphysics, it is clear that the unresolved doubts prevent the manifestation of truth. Indeed, leaving the above-mentioned conflict unresolved leaves us only with an inconsistent set of propositions. However, because we know that they are inconsistent, we also know that at least one of these has to be false. So we are just left with an inconsistent set of propositions, which is an unresolved problem, leaving us in doubt. So which one is false of the propositions in this inconsistent set? So, however, because we know that they are inconsistent, we also know that at least one of these has to be false. Therefore, whoever asserts all these propositions together knowingly states something false, and if he does so from a university cathedra, he becomes a falsus doctor who is morally responsible for his false teachings. So no wonder that in one of his sermons, Thomas expresses moral outrage over the procedure in which the masters of arts are trying to avoid the burden of this responsibility by their usual disclaimers, attributing the claims contrary to faith to someone else, usually to Aristotle. As he says, there are some people who work in philosophy and state some things that are not true according to the faith. And when they are told that this is incompatible with faith, they reply that this is a claim of the philosopher. Nevertheless, they do not assert it, but rather they merely recite the words of the philosopher. Such is the false prophet or the false teacher. For it is the same thing to raise it out without resolving it and to concede it. The main point here is that the usual disclaimers of the masters of arts, whether they are sincere or not, simply assert the superiority of faith but leave the inconsistency between their principles and the articles of faith philosophically unresolved. Therefore, their teaching definitely has to involve some falsity, whether they are willing to take personal responsibility for it by asserting it ex persona sua or not. And so Thomas's outrage is completely understandable. But in fact, this outrage did not. As masters were always quick to subject whatever they taught to the authority of the church, but much rather by a need to defend philosophy. As we could see, the Everistic methodological conception leaves the conflicts between faith and philosophy radically unresolved. The further maneuvers involving the usual disclaimers, attributing the conflicting claims to Aristotle, or even to the philosophical principles themselves from which such conclusions follow, only worsen the situation. For by these disclaimers, the masters of arts simply testified that the philosopher and his philosophical principles, or indeed the principles of natural reason in general, are essentially flawed and can easily lead anyone following them astray, insofar as they can lead to conclusions genuinely opposed to the revealed truths of faith. But from here, it is just one easy step for university authorities, known since the dawn of universities up to the present time, for handling moot academic questions with radical administrative solutions, to eliminate such dangerous and radically flawed discipline from their curriculum altogether, right? Luckily, we have a person present who can testify to the importance of such considerations. So the Everistic conception in the given historical context involved not only a theoretical limitation upon the autonomy of philosophy by simply subjecting the validity of its principles to the authority of faith, but also a serious practical threat to the very existence of the doctrine in the curriculum. But then, in view of these considerations, I think we can safely conclude that the freedom of the handmaiden in her reliable handling of her own business proclaimed by the philosopher saint did in fact involve a much greater autonomy than the precarious rule of the lady of the philosophers.
Yes.
And that is my conclusion.
Julia, thank you so much. It was beautiful. And Maimonides makes exactly the same point several times about that you should not claim that faith is superior to knowledge, to philosophy, but he says something, he says that then you falsify faith. It's not that you hurt the autonomy of philosophy, but since faith cannot contradict philosophy, if you see things that supposedly were revealed and they contradict logic and philosophy, then you should revisit these revelations and try to understand them differently, or try to understand the true meaning, because they could metaphors. And usually he says that revelation is revealed to us with metaphors, by metaphors. So, and this is his attitude, meaning don't tweak the philosophy, but you are allowed to tweak the faith also. In order to...
So, I think it is not just a one-way street. That is, when we find the apparent inconsistency, that inconsistency can be resolved in a number of different ways. Obviously, one of the propositions in an inconsistent set cannot be maintained to be true in the literal sense in which it is stated. So
Julia, just one second. Technical
yes.
point. I'm just removing the share so we can see each other better. Or you need
Yeah.
you need to
Oh
see.
yes. Oh yes. Okay. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So yeah, we don't need that any longer. Okay. So
Sorry,
you
what is
removed it.
this? Here we are. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I don't think one should say that it is only the theological propositions that are tweakable, let's say, and are subject to reinterpretation. Because that is precisely why I brought up this example of Aquinas' handling of the Eucharist based on Avicenna's reinterpretation of the Aristotelian formula for the definition of an accident, that an accident ends in subjecto. Avicenna argues that this cannot be the proper definition of accident because no essential or quantitative definition can contain the notion of being.
Right.
And he has good philosophical arguments for that. I treat this problem in a separate paper in much detail. But that is rather technical. But the point is that the quantitative definition signifies what is common to several individuals of the same species, right? In which they do not differ. But individuals of the same species differ precisely in their individual being. Okay. So
could you not describe this conflict in something, in some way that you described when we had our conference? It's the truth is that we cannot be like Humpty Dumpty, and we cannot be autistic, meaning that the languages that faith and philosophy should find some language that will not impose itself on the other, meaning it will not be autistic, it will not be unchangeable.
Yes.
It should be mutually influential.
Yes, and that is precisely what is crystallizing in dialogue, and actually not just dialogue, which is too neutral, in actual disputations. So we do have to take opposing positions in order for us to be able to better articulate our own ideas. Because if we are just left alone and relying on our own resources all the time, we are just getting into this self-affirmation and self-reinforcement of the same, possibly flawed ideas, which can, however, be cured, as it were, by these actual disputations, when our ideas have to be tested against the and have to be validated against the opposition.
Okay, but there are many ways to do that, of course.
Yes, unfortunately, there are not so intelligent ways of doing that when the disputation deteriorates into sophistical argumentation or brawl just for the sake of winning, as opposed to a genuine dialectical disputation, which is not a zero-sum game, because both parties are winning in understanding. I'm sorry, Jeremy.
No, Jewel, I really appreciated the paper, and I think you did a really skillful job, I think, showing the dead end of the Averroist kind of position. But I'm struck in listening to this. I mean, the thing that you showed is if you just renounce the question and just kind of throw up your hands, you're really renouncing reason, but also to the detriment of faith. And it's related to the point that you're making now, because then at the end of the day, all you have is the coercion of faith over against reason. And that's going to be destructive of reason, or it's going to be destructive of faith, because then people will have to feel that they have to renounce the faith in the name of their reason. And either way, it's destructive of the possibility of genuine conversation, because you give up the possibility that you can have a conversation that moves forward on the basis of anything besides one power against another, which I think is what we see a lot of in the academy, really.
And in fact, it is not just between warring individuals. But it is just a general schizophrenic state of the modern mind that I think you just described. That if they are even considering perceived conflicts between faith and reason, if they tend to leave the perceived conflict unresolved, and there are these all sorts of
or you're just
can-be tactics to leave it alone. Yeah?
You're just obliged to choose. So you either accept reason and renounce faith as incredible, or you accept faith and renounce science. And we're stuck in this kind of unresolvable tension.
Or you just have your workday materialism and Sunday spirituality, in practical terms. Let's just leave the conflict alone, and
there is another
try to put up with it.
There is another practical, very, very practical, down-to-earth problem. If you say that faith is superior because, let's say, legally superior, so faith can, you say you must accept faith over logic, then you have a very practical problem, which we see. Take the work of monasteries or religious orders, to do charity and to behave, to make the world a better place, to help people. So if you have reason, you have a tool. If you accept that reason is a good tool, so you have something to work with. But if you throw reason away because you say faith is superior, so you can reach all kind of crazy ideas of what's good for people, because you say the reason is not, I don't follow the reason, I follow maybe some mythical ideas or what I think faith is, and terrible things can happen because of that. Because you abandon reason.
Yeah.
You abandon, I mean the reason there more in the sense of common sense than philosophy, when like aesthetics or the other thing that Aristo spoke about.
I think there's this, I wouldn't even make this distinction concerning the abandonment of reason that you just made. Not pure philosophical reason, but ordinary common sense. Because I think there must be a continuity between these highfalutin principles and ordinary common sense. After all, that is why Aristotle's philosophy is often hailed as the common sense philosophy. Right. Because it was he philosophized at a time when masses of people have not yet lost their common sense.
Exactly, because they did not take it seriously that faith has a formal superiority over common sense.
Mhm.
Because if you do, you don't, then you are stuck. So you either need revelation for every step that you do, or you imagine revelation. You forge revelation for every step that
Mhm.
you do. You do that everything that I am doing is because I had some revelation. So you have to start inventing revelation because you
Mhm.
just denounced common sense because common sense contradicts faith. So faith so common sense is not reliable. It's a terrible, once you do that, it can have terrible consequences.
Mhm.
Well, I think Julia's paper is a great expression of, well, he quotes Aquinas saying that grace perfects nature, doesn't destroy it. And I think this is one of the ways in which grace or faith refines common sense, actually, or perfects common
Right.
sense by relating it to some sort of absolute principle that is related to maybe not so much with reason, but in a sort of participatory way of a personal relationship, I think. So in that sense, yeah, it's the Averroistic conception destroys nature if it says that there's some sort of supernatural cause that can invalidate whatever reason or natural reason says. So in that sense, I really enjoyed the paper.
Thank you.
And it provides a very, in medieval times, it was a real problem. Nowadays, if someone says he had a revelation, we diagnose him with schizophrenia. But the thing is, you need some kind of control to find out what, if you don't have common sense, the problem is that, that's why I asked Julia the whole time, if Aquinas agreed that you can tweak what the definitions of faith, because we don't speak language has different meaning, it's flexible, our understanding is flexible. So do we have a way to take all kind of how you call it, of foreign, like wild grass or wild thing that grew into our ideas, try to keep it clean and keep it good by using reason, or you
What's
understand
the
what
question again? I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that
the
I
question
understand the question.
is that if you accept Aquinas' idea that philosophy cannot come to falsehood, and common sense also, so we can conclude that common sense could lead to falsehood, but it usually will not, or you can trust it that it will not lead to falsehood. Then if you go back, you do sort of feedback from common sense to faith, and you say, okay, something grew into the patch of faith that I have that really doesn't belong there. It came with the wind, and I have to take it out and keep the patch clean. And not you have a way to rethink about the faith.
Yeah, it is. There's a constant give and take. I would say in the course of life, right? In a human life, there has to be always this back and forth between common sense and articles of faith, and they can be religious teachings, doctrines, or articles of faith. Can give us a structure by which we live our lives as guided by common sense, incorporating religious doctrine, such as don't fornicate with your neighbor's wife and that sort of thing, which is also common sense, but it is also sort of reinforced by the Decalogue, right? So it's there are these obvious meeting points between what you refer to as common sense, so everyday thinking, and what should be the reasonable way of living our lives, guided by common sense, which is also guided by these religious principles and teachings. And there has to be reflection back and forth, and it is so if you are not fornicating with the neighbor's wife just because you are fearing eternal spanking in hell, then you can also realize that, hey, that shouldn't be the right reason for wanting to do the right thing, because then you are just behaving like a well-trained animal, fearing the whip and going after the carrot, or the stick and going after the carrot. So if you are ever reflecting on the practical principles that genuinely guide your life, or should or ought to guide your life, then you realize that, hey, it is, I should obey, not just because it is coming from a supreme authority, but it is coming from a supreme authority because that is the right thing to follow and to live by. That principle, for instance.
The New Testament is stories about Jesus that have tremendous parallels in the Talmud when he complains against the Pharisees. So actually, I see it's this one, his complaints. He says they take some kind of imagined religious authority over common sense. And you should follow common sense. And there are many stories, like many things like this, that you should, that common sense or human decency, whatever you call it, contradicts it. So you have to follow that. And this should affect your faith and not the other way around.
Yeah. Actually, one good example of this, I think, is Aquinas is on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists, the little treatise. And there, what's really interesting is that he takes on this notion of Averroes, that there's only one mind for everyone, and he says it's against the faith. But then he goes and demonstrates that actually what is in accordance with the faith is also in accordance with common sense and with the original meaning of Aristotle. So it's a wonderful exposition of how common sense, Aristotle, and the Christian faith all line up against Averroes, or the Averroists, like Boethius of Dacia or Sandra Brahma, who by not being guided by faith, actually they get into all sorts of rational. They go down rational blind alleys in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Very interesting. It's
Can I raise a question?
Sure.
I'm sorry for diving in too late. I was delayed, but a general question about how would you think that either of these sides, the Averroists or Aquinas, would suggest to deal with the current directions of relativism in reason, the erosion of reason?
Obviously, that is since they regard, Aquinas especially regards reason as the specific difference of a human person. That is what naturally distinguishes a human person from a brute animal. Abandonment of reason is abandonment of humanity.
Yes, but today you're in an era where people aren't insulted by being called a brute animal. Okay, you tell them the difference between a man and a brute animal is the reason is they say, fine, I am a brute animal, speak to me.
Yeah.
Explain to me what's wrong with that, yeah?
What's wrong with that? That if you are a brute animal, that you cannot
Yes,
possibly
yeah.
understand what I'm saying. So you shouldn't ask a question. You should just go out and browse
And yet
in
I
the
can,
fields.
and yet I apparently am more prepared for this conversation as a brute animal. What I'm saying is that the erosion of reason, that's what I'm.
How would you be better prepared for any conversation whatsoever if you are a brute animal?
Because I accept limitations more than you do.
But you cannot accept limitations because you cannot possibly understand such words as limitations, and because being a brute animal, you do not speak.
Is this not speaking in the sense that you define what speaking is?
Yeah, speaking is conveying human thoughts.
There's
And brute animals cannot possibly have human thoughts.
in that
They
sense,
cannot
we have
convey
an
human
issue.
thoughts by babbling like a parrot or a baboon.
This is what I fear, because what I
Yes.
fear is that if I follow Aquinas, and you represent him beautifully, if I follow, and because I don't know him, I know you, right?
Mhm.
But if I follow you, then what I have is I have another set of dogmatic closed definitions, meaning we have a definition of what humanity is. Humanity is the ability to reason in such and such a way, in a way that I can do now. There is no point in trying to understand what passing a Turing test is. There is no point in trying to understand what the interaction between us and the rest of because we have our own internal language game. So what I'm afraid of is that we are that in terms of where this is going is that the structure becomes just as dogmatic as we would
It is.
find with the Averroists.
Yeah. I think I get your point, but the only this is actually Aristotle and his strategy in the metaphysics. How would you argue against people denying first principles? You just point out the absurdities following from the position they are taking. So if you are trying to win a rational argument by taking the position that you are a brute animal, then you cannot but acknowledge, since you are trying to win a rational argument, right? So you have to abide by minimal principles of reason if you want to conclude anything from your position or from my position against you. You have to work with human concepts, human ideas, human thoughts, operations of human reason, which would defeat by themselves. Your own activity would defeat your position. It's just like yelling out from behind a closed door, "I'm not here," right? And
Yeah.
of course,
And I do that all the time with my kids. Yeah.
So exactly, and they know that you are there and that you cannot fool them, right? That is precisely the point. In the same way, this would-be brute who thinks he is so smart by claiming to be a brute, just undercutting his own position by wanting to be smart and to uphold this position that he's a brute animal. The two cannot stand together.
The way I understood Maimonides speaks about this point in his Guide to the Perplexed, that rational argument, the way you describe it, is, that's why I asked you before the beginning, this thing, what you call reason. He said it's, there are 2 points, two aspects to God's grace. One is the ability to reason, and the second is the desire to reason. So the ability by itself, we can say, okay, we are able, but we are too lazy. Why should we do that? We can say, oh, the whole thing is nothing. Let's neglect it. But one aspect of God's grace is the desire to reason, the desire to understand, and so you either take it or not. Meaning, it's a gift, but it's not enforced. It's not rammed into our throats. So I think what you said is very compatible with this idea.
Oh, absolutely.
That philosophy. What?
It is not just compatible. It is, I think, it is the very same position. Because, of course, we can abandon just any sort of human activity. We can stop talking, we can stop walking, we can stop working, etc.
Difficult to stop eating what we should do, but yes. Yes.
Right. But the point is that, of course, it is to perform some sort of activity as human agents involves a willingness to perform activity. And so a human activity as such has to be performed by choice for the sake of preconceived end, etc. Now, but since we can at any point not want to do something, we can abandon this or that or that or that. In fact, a huge number of human activities. We can stop going to theater, we stop listening to music, we stop reading or writing poetry, we can stop going to church, or thinking theological thoughts, etc. And the more and more we peel away from human activities, the more and more brutish our life form is becoming. And this is precisely what we are actually experiencing in ever broadening swaths of contemporary society. Most people's lives are reduced to, just think of these near vegetative druggies who can genuinely abandon a human form of life for the sake of this half-sensitive, almost purely vegetative form of existence. It is possible, but while they are metaphysically still human, morally they are not. That's all.
I would like to pose a challenge for our next meeting. It is very, very interesting and phrased very well. It was really, really very interesting. And if you could send us your paper, we will put it. Only we have some place to put it, right?
Yes.
Yes. In our library. What I want to ask is something which is more in Malachi's area of something that could be described as again the end and the means, the teleological point. Perhaps you can do something which is a bit different and see from where does it lead you. Faith, if it leads you, we can say something very simple. The proof that faith is right and should be held is because it takes you to a good place. So the end proves the beginning. The fact, something what Jula mentioned now, if you have no faith, then you become something which is
less than human.
Okay.
Somewhat less than you could be, naturally.
So I think that every religious order, every religious schools, I think this is what it tries to teach, you know, that look at the result, look where I'm led to. See what is done, what is done nowadays in 2020, in the times of the corona, in times of how can I cope? So it's not only that faith is a tool, but it is faith as a gift that makes us what we are, not because it's a good tool, but this is maybe the only road to survive and to be decent and to do good. If you could address this point, Malaka, if it's relevant to you. You are silenced now. We cannot hear you. You are muted. No, now he cut himself. Now he disappeared.
Rabbi, you can address for the next time.
If possible.
Yeah.
If possible.
I think that is bigger bite than what we can chew right now. So whether okay, so this is a big issue generally.
What?
This is a bigger bite than we can now chew. I think that is basically what you're asking. I think is a big question of whether.
Right. I don't want to talk about the big question. You're right, because once you say, the problem is when you, exactly what you said, you take a big bite, then something evaporates in the cloud. I'm really not used to philosophy, so I'm really lost in a cloud of long sentences. My mind stops working. And that's what happens when you talk about big issues. You need big sentences. And so you're right, it's a big issue. But the question is whether we cannot take a small slice of it and just talk about the here and now, not about the moral things, to the moral question, the complete moral question, but about simple things of decency, of morality is a complex thing that so much was written about that actually it lost its meaning, I think. But we can have take much simpler ideas. And Julia, you are doing that the whole time. You're a master of using simple words and simple concepts. And what?
I said one tries.
One tries, yes.
With James Bond. Okay, so that is my favorite James Bond quote.
So perhaps either you, Jeremy, or Malachi could address this a point of simply decency, social responsibility, decency, in very simple terms, and to see how the road that led from faith to I say the road from faith to decency. You wrote about, you spoke about revelation and reason, but there is maybe also something from faith to decency.
Mm-hmm. So
Because
sorry.
Rolly will say, of course, people say that I'm decent, even though I don't have any faith, and I don't want to hear. Once I begin to hear Aristotle's ideas, they don't mean anything to me, and I'm a very decent human being, even as an animal. So,
Okay.
or what is the difference? What signifies a man
Right.
of faith as a decent human being?
I can take a stab at it unless Malachi would like to.
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, I'll take a stab. What's our date for the next time?
1 second. I'll open the calendar. Okay.
Another good thing about brute animals is that they don't take offense.
Oh, actually, I could see some cat being very offended.
Yeah, I take cats out of this equation. I don't.
Okay.
Cats are
Yeah.
very difficult. Yeah.
They are not brute animals. They're much
Yeah.
worse. Anyway, if we are talking about Monday, so how about either July 13th or July 20th?
Either of those dates works fine for me.
Rolly, you remember when our conference is?
It was going, oh,
Rolly?
You mean the
Nessa Min
Bible?
Wittenberg,
The
yes.
Bible. Wait a sec. At least on my schedule, it doesn't clash. But I might not have everything updated.
Okay. I think it's 13th. So I think 20 will be very good for us. Jeremy,
okay.
they're good. It's good for you?
Yeah, it's fine for me.
Malachi, Julia?
Yeah, I think I can be present. Yes.
And your input, Malachi, I think will be very interesting about this point also. We'll really appreciate comments and because I think this is the real issue nowadays. But to try to be a better human being. That's the. Otherwise, why the whole thing? It's not worth anything. Okay, but that's my personal understanding. After reaching the mature age of 70, if you're not being a better human being, so why be at all?
Uh-huh. So, the same time,
Same time.
perfect.
Same time, it is 6 GMT.
Yeah.
Yes. And the date again, just to make sure.
July 20th.
The 20th. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Perfect.
Sounds
Thanks,
good to
everybody.
me.
Okay, so Rolly, I'm sending you an invite right away.
Yeah, and I'll put it in my schedule, and I'll add everyone to the schedule.
Okay, very good.
Julia,
thank you for a great
Yes.
paper.
Julia,
just
it was
wanted-
beautiful.
Yeah, that was great, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure the person I was thinking about when I spoke was a scholar from Warwick University called Steve Fuller, and he has a very
Yes.
interesting background. He was one of those people who spent their education years with the Jesuits, and I
Mhm.
think he's been making them pay for that ever since. And he deals with concepts of post-truth, and he's saying that the sophists and sophistry has been getting a bad rap for 2,500 years.
Mhm.
And it's about time that the straight-laced philosophers will actually try to deal with sophists instead of just waving them off as absurd. He's a very interesting fellow. I'll send you guys the information. You might find him an interesting sparring partner, I think.
All right. Thanks.
Sure.
Signing off. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye,
So,
everybody.
bye-bye.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.